The Barossa Valley hadn't changed, its air still thick with sun-warmed eucalyptus. Its vines stretched in quiet rows like history itself. But Thomas Hammond had. 10 years gone, 10 years buried under shame and silence. He returned not as the hopeful heir of the Hammond name, but as a man rebuilt by betrayal. Once accused of embezzlement, cast out by his own blood, Thomas had vanished. And now, he was back with a different name on the guest ledger and a storm bottled tightly inside. The Hammond estate had flourished in his absence. The family's name, etched on premium labels and vineyard signage, now belonged entirely to Caleb, his younger brother, the one who'd watched Thomas burn and walked away with the inheritance. Their father was gone, the funeral long past. The estate had not waited for him. Thomas checked into a modest room under the name Tom Harding. His first stop wasn't the house, but the cellar door. No one recognized him. Why would they? His face had aged, sharper, leaner, eyes like scorched earth. He ordered a glass of Hammond Reserve Shiraz, the 2012 vintage, his vintage, the one he'd helped bring into the world before Caleb pushed him out of it. As the rich red swirled in the glass, he smiled. Still good, still his. He walked the estate's perimeter like a ghost, retracing his steps past the fermenting sheds, past the old oak barrels he once hand-sealed with wax, and past the corner of the property where his father once said, "This will be yours one day." Now it belonged to Caleb. So did the accolades. So did the press. That evening, Thomas ran into Sarah, an old friend from his early days on the estate, now a journalist covering the regional wine scene. Her expression shifted as recognition dawned. "You're back," she said. "Why?" he simply replied. "Because some roots don't die quietly." Meanwhile, the family was celebrating. Caleb toasted another international award, charm on full display, a winemaker in tailored linen, draped in legacy. Inside the house, the staff buzzed, the wine flowed, and no one noticed the man in the shadows, watching from the end of the driveway. Thomas began laying the groundwork. He visited vineyard hands, quietly reintroducing himself. Some were glad, others nervous. A few still believed the story Caleb sold, that Thomas was the thief, the saboteur. But Thomas wasn't here to defend himself, he was here to unravel. In the final moments, Thomas stood alone in the vines beneath a rising Barossa moon. His fingers brushed against an old vine he'd planted with his father. The bark was rough, the roots deep like memory. From his coat he pulled out a folded document, an earlier version of the will, one that bore his name at the top. He stared toward the Hammond house as its lights burned late into the night. Let them drink tonight, he thought. The real fermentation begins tomorrow. Thomas's return was silent, but the Barossa Valley had started to whisper. Beneath the golden canopy of grapes and the polished tasting rooms, secrets had begun to sour. While Caleb basked in the glow of magazine covers and exclusive trade partnerships, Thomas moved like shadow between the vines, careful and precise. His name was still hidden, but his eyes missed nothing. Under the guise of a boutique distributor interested in expanding into boutique Australian wines, Thomas met with the Hammond Estate's vineyard workers, contractors, and long-time suppliers. Conversations bloomed seemingly casual, but designed to extract late payments, odd discrepancies. Workers let go after years of loyalty. One mentioned that the irrigation system hadn't been replaced in over a decade, though records said otherwise. Another spoke of wine sold off book barrels that never appeared in the inventory. It was rot, and rot spread. At night, Thomas reviewed documents smuggled from an old contact in the regional council. The estate's environmental compliance reports were riddled with doctored signatures and vague statements. The deeper he dug, the more he realized the empire Caleb built rested on forged roots. But it wasn't just Caleb's ambition that sickened Thomas, it was how familiar it all felt. The patterns of lies, the carefully curated facade, the same tactics used to cut him out a decade ago. He met Sarah again, this time at the back of a quiet pub where the local winemakers gathered for beers and gossip. She leaned in over her notebook. You're not just back to visit. No, he said simply. I'm here to tell the truth. But it has to be the kind that can't be denied. Sarah agreed to help on one condition: full transparency. No games, no manipulation. You've had 10 years to stew. Don't turn this into another war of wine and ego. Thomas nodded, but his eyes flickered. Some things had fermented too long to pour sweet. A breakthrough came when he snuck into the original storage shed late one night, long since replaced by Caleb's modern facilities. There, hidden behind decades-old crates, he found them, dusty bottles from an unlisted batch, hand-labeled. A test vintage. One of them bore his own initials, Death Reserve. He remembered it now, an experimental line he and their father had designed together. Never released due to technical issues, but these bottles had aged beautifully. Why were they hidden? He brought one to Sarah. Taste this, he said. She sipped, then froze. This isn't Caleb's style, this is something else. Exactly. The final scene cuts to Caleb in his office, flipping through a glossy marketing pitch. A notification buzzes on his phone. Cyrus Linton prepares bombshell story on Hammond family fraud. His smile falters. The camera pans back to the vineyard. Thomas walks between the rows, wind in his hair, bottle in hand. One truth uncorked, many more to come. The first bomb dropped on a quiet Tuesday morning. Sarah's article, titled "The Vineyard Veil," hit the region like a storm. With surgically sourced records and insider testimony, it exposed Caleb Hammond's rot, falsified vintages, buried debts, and environmental violations masked under elegant branding. The Hammond name, once synonymous with integrity, was now a question mark. Wine blogs buzzed. Exporters backed out. Investors paused. Caleb went on the defensive. He denied everything in a press release thick with corporate sheen. Accused Sarah of slander. Blamed former disgruntled employees. But in every statement, his polished tone trembled. And in every shadow behind him, Thomas loomed. Thomas didn't hide anymore. The first time he walked back into the Hammond estate courtyard, journalists trailed behind him. Caleb was hosting a tasting with international buyers when Thomas appeared, dressed in black, calm as stone. Thomas Hammond, he introduced, co-creator of the 2012 Reserve, and, as it turns out, still legally entitled to this land. Gasps, camera clicks, Caleb paled. Behind closed doors, the reunion with Eleanor was quieter, shocking in its gentleness. Her hands, shaking from Parkinson's, clutched his face. You came back, she murmured. I waited too long. Her eyes were clouded but clear enough to recognize what had broken and who was trying to rebuild. At night, the house was no longer silent. Arguments behind doors, whispers between staff. Eleanor sat between her sons at the dining table one evening, her voice low. Is this vineyard worth becoming strangers? Neither answered. But the pain sat there, decanted between them. Thomas moved into the old guest house not to rest, but to observe. To plan. But Eleanor changed something in him. Her condition, her fragility humanized the war. She asked to be taken on a slow tour of the vines. In her wheelchair, wrapped in a faded shawl, she whispered the history of each row. She knew their age, their story. She knew where Thomas's father had first kissed her. He made a deal with shame, she said. Don't let it inherit you. Meanwhile, Caleb scrambled. In secret, he drafted a new will excluding Thomas entirely. But Thomas had already found the original locked in a safe deposit box under their father's name. Not only naming Thomas as co-heir, but praising the design of the lost the reserve. At the next shareholders' dinner, a polished affair, meant to distract from the fire, Thomas appeared again. This time with something else, one of the hidden Death Reserve 2008 bottles, dust brushed away, label intact. Tonight, I offer you something we haven't had in a decade, he said, voice steady. The truth. He poured. The room grew still. Even Caleb didn't speak. Outside, under a moonlit canopy of vines, the wind shifted. The harvest was coming, and it would not be sweet. The vineyard quieted, but not with peace, only dread. The Hammond name still shimmered on labels, but buyers hesitated, whispers grew. And for the first time, Caleb looked hunted. At his side, fewer staff. In his eyes, sleepless nights. Thomas should have felt victorious, but he didn't. Eleanor's health was slipping fast. Her hands trembled more, her voice faltered, and some days she didn't recognize what year it was. Thomas stayed close, not out of obligation, but out of a grief blooming too late. She asked him one morning to walk her through the oldest part of the vineyard. "I want to feel the soil," she whispered. One more time. He wheeled her between rows heavy with memory. That night, she called him to her bedside. "I need to tell you something your father never did." He sat down, bracing. "Your father knew you were innocent," she said. "He found out months after you left." Caleb lied, yes, but your father, he chose silence. Said preserving the family's reputation mattered more than justice. Thomas stared at her. The truth, when spoken aloud, cracked something in him. His exile had never been a mistake. It had been a choice. One made behind wine-stained lips and locked doors. "I wanted to tell you," Eleanor cried, "but I was weak, and I'm sorry." In the dim glow of her room, the vines rustling in the distance, Thomas felt the shape of his anger shift. Not vanish, just widen. This wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about legacy, and the kind worth saving. Days later, he met Caleb in the fermentation hall, cool, echoing, filled with unfinished barrels and raw air. They hadn't spoken since the dinner. "I never hated you," Caleb said, surprising them both. "I just couldn't be you." Thomas answered quietly, "And I couldn't forgive you, until now." A pause. "I'm not here to rebuild what you broke," Thomas continued, "but I won't destroy it either." He tore the forged will in half and handed the originals back. "I'll keep the truth. You keep your pride, but stay out of my way." Caleb nodded, once half respect, half warning. That night he packed a bag. By morning, he was gone. Thomas sat beside Eleanor as the sun rose, her breath shallow, her hands clasped around a bottle of Thest, Reserve 2008. "Pour me just a sip," she said. He did. She tasted, smiled, still bright, like you. She passed before midday. The vines swayed, heavy with fruit not yet picked. Thomas walked them alone that evening. At the edge of the property he planted a single new vine. No label, no plaque. Just soil and roots. He whispered to the wind, "Enough blood in the barrels," and turned back toward the house where the legacy could now breathe. Blood and Barrels, Episode 5, The Final Press. The season turned, grapes ripened, the press began. Thomas now walked the estate, not as a ghost of exile, but as the man who chose to stay. Caleb was gone, no letters, no farewells, just a silence that suited them both. In his place, Thomas had inherited the land, the debt, the bruised reputation, and the aching memory of Eleanor. But also something new, freedom. He made good on the promise. The Hammond brand was retired. In its place, Elira was born, a smaller label, rooted in honesty, named after the Kawerna word for truth. He stripped the opulence from the estate and opened its gates. No more VIP tastings. No more false stories. Workers were welcomed back. Sarah helped tell the real one. One sunny morning, Thomas led a group of young winemakers through the vines, sharing not just notes of soil and tannin, but the story of mistakes, silence, and forgiveness. He poured from the Reserve 2008, once hidden, now honored. It was never just about wine, he said. It was about the people who make it and the truths they leave behind. In the tasting room, a new plaque had been placed, in memory of Eleanor Hammond, who loved the land and the people on it. Sarah's final article echoed across the region, the vineyard that chose truth. It didn't glorify. It simply told what happened. Thomas kept the compass. Sometimes it spun. Sometimes it settled. But every Sunday, He still walked to the old vine he'd planted alone. No bottle, no camera. Just fingers pressed into the earth. On the final day of harvest, he opened a bottle from the cellar, one from the forbidden stash. The label read, "The Reserve 2008. He poured 2 glasses, one for him, one he set beside the empty chair. Then he raised his glass. To endings that begin again." The sun dipped below the vines, and the vineyard exhaled.